Hello, good evening, and welcome to everyone who's tuned in for today's session on Master Speak. Last week, we had the pleasure of listening to the Elvis of business, as I said, and I quoted an article which said that Mr. Tom Peters, he was with us last Friday, and I'm sure those of you who had joined in last Friday had an absolutely wonderful time listening to Tom Peters. And today's session, joining us, we have yet another powerful keynote speaker and a global leadership expert, Mr. Keith Coates, who is a futurist and is passionate about what it means to be a future fit leader. To tell you a bit about Keith, Keith is a South African citizen based in London and a founding partner of international consultancy TomorrowToday Global. He has been at the heart of the global leadership conversation for over 20 years in an array of settings, including academic, corporate, NGO, and government. Keith lectures, presents, consults in leadership matters around the world, including frequent work that he does in China, Russia, India, USA, Brazil, Europe, and Africa. He's a regular lecturer in numerous executive education leadership programs at London Business School, Duke, and Gordon Institute of Business Science in South Africa. Now, Keith has worked with both leaders and their executive teams in numerous international blue chip companies across a wide array of industries and sectors such as Boeing, Credit Suisse, Nestle, Saudi Aramco, Rio Tinto, Deutsche Bank, and the list just goes on. Today, Keith is joining us, and he's going to talk to us about a very interesting topic, same planet, different world. But before I hand it over to Keith, let me just do some housekeeping check, as I do always. I hope each one of you and your family who are watching us today on Master Speak are doing fine, they're safe, and they're healthy. If that's the case, please press the like button so we know that everything is fine at your end. It's important for us to know that. Let us know which city do you belong to and which city you are joining us from today. I'm sure Keith would be interested to know that as well. Don't forget to tag your friends, your colleagues, who you want to join you in this session today of Master Speak. Tag them in the comment section so that they can also join us and be a part of this learning journey that we have for you all today. Lastly, keep your comments coming. Keep your questions coming. 2 lucky questions at the end of the show, as I always say, will be picked up for, or they will be nominated as the 2 lucky questions, and they would be picked up for an Amazon gift voucher that we're going to be shipping to the lucky winner. So stay with us till the end of the session and keep your questions coming. Keith will be more than happy to answer your questions. So without much ado, I would like to hand over to Keith. Keith, thank you so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to listening to you and on the topic that I just spoke of.
Rakesh, thank you very much, and hello everybody, wherever you are in the world and whatever time zone you're in. It's just a real privilege for me to be part of this series and to share in it. So thank you again very much. We're looking at the theme of same planet, different world, and our agenda in the brief time we've got is I want to position why thinking like a futurist is so important. I'd like to look at how we can pay attention to context, which is always a part of every leadership conversation, and sense making, of course, which goes with that. I've got basically the heart of what we're going to be doing in the time we've got together is to ask and answer 5 key questions at this time. And then I want to share one thought with you as to what you can do going forward. And that is about being a broker of hope. So as Rakesh said, I'm a futurist, and that always has some interesting stories attached to it. I don't know why they always happen at Heathrow, but that seems to be where most of my stories have collected themselves. But I remember once coming through Heathrow, and you get 2 types of immigration officials. One that wants to be your best friend, and you feel like you're never going to get into the country you're going into because they're chatting about this and that. And they're just being friendly and doing their job, but in a soft, friendly kind of way. But then you get the other kind of official, and he or she gives you the impending sense that you're about to be arrested or deported before you even take a step into that country. And I remember having one of those gentlemen once at Heathrow, and he was very stern. We hadn't exchanged any pleasantries, and suddenly he looked up at my form, because on the landing form that you were required to fill in under occupation, I always would write futurist. and his brow creased, and he looked up at me very sternly, and I knew exactly what part of the form he had got stuck on. And he looks up at me and says, "Futurist, eh? What is that?" So I start to explain, and I'm no sooner into my explanation, and he stops me dead in my tracks, and he says, "You're a consultant. Just put down consultant. Make my life easier and your life easier. You're a consultant." And I said to him, "But sir, if I put down consultant, what's going to be your first question after that? You're going to then ask me what I consult on. I'm going to say futures, and then we're back to square one." One more quick story. I remember once having a gentleman who looked up at me and said, "So, what's your favorite flower?" Now, I don't know anything about flowers, and I was a little bit perturbed, and it was a very strange question, but they always determine the conversation, of course. So I answered. And next minute, we were having a detailed conversation about flowers and flower arranging. And then it occurred to me he had misread my writing. Instead of reading futurist, he had read florist. Mental note, write clearer next time. And sometimes the kind of comments I get are, "Futurist, can you tell me who's going to win this IPL or win the Premier League or something?" That's a fortune teller. All that a futurist does is what is on your screen. It's the person who intentionally builds capacity to see and understand the implications and meaning of change. Now, if you're a leader, I would like to suggest that given your leadership role and responsibility, you should be able to call yourself a futurist, because given that definition of what a futurist does and who a futurist is, that surely covers a key functionality of leadership responsibility, seeing and understanding the implications and meaning of change. Of course, any good leader has to always take into account the context, and it would be nice if we could see clearly into the future, but I don't think we've ever really been able to see clearly into the future. Context is something that goes in and out of focus continually. And smart leaders realize that in order then to cope with this kind of in and out of focus, this uncertainty, this ambiguity, this inability to see clearly for a long period of time, we need to build frameworks that help us do this work. A key way to summarize where we all find ourselves, although we might be experiencing the global pandemic in very different ways, is that we are in a new normal. We know this. We have a rising sense, I suspect, that we're not going to go back to the way things were. And it was Winston Churchill who first coined the phrase, "Don't waste a good crisis." We are in a global crisis, an unprecedented crisis in many respects. And so there is an embedded opportunity in the midst of this context in which we find ourselves not to waste it. And maybe this will become apparent as I go through. The first question, I guess, that is an obvious one that we need to ask ourselves is, could we have predicted this? Could we have foreseen this coming? And some people might say no. I was with a group of executives in the Gulf area the other day who weren't quite as ready to say, yes, we could predict this, or we could have predicted this. But generally, most of the leaders that I've engaged with over the last 3 or 4 months have said categorically, yes, we should have seen this coming. There were a number of global experts who quite accurately predicted what it was we were about to experience.
The largest threat, if we use the word, to the UK population is someone in China who's been infected from an animal that's received antibiotics to improve its growth. It's transferred to the farmer, which is transferred to community, and gets on a plane to the UK. What good is it for the UK just to be worried about what's happening here? It's about those interconnections across the world. So I think it's the underpinning of why governance matters, that actually our world is interconnected. And if you want to solve these problems, you can't do it at a go-it-alone approach.
It was a global medical expert at the Hay Festival in the UK in 2015. Very scary how accurate she was in predicting the very specific nature of a global crisis like the one we've got now. So if we could have predicted this or should have predicted it, why then were we caught so short? Why was it that, especially at a corporate level, it seems that we were so ill prepared for this? I want to suggest 3 reasons. Number one, I don't think we were seeing far enough. Jim Data is a futurist who lives in Honolulu, Hawaii, and he's regarded as one of the founding fathers of the discipline of futures. Wonderful thinker, wonderful person, and whenever I am there on work, I do get to go to Hawaii fairly frequently on work, I might add, but I love spending time with Jim because of his contribution to the discipline that I'm part of and his sharp thinking. And he's given the discipline of futures what is known as Data's second law of futures, which states the following: any useful idea about the future must appear ridiculous. He then adds a very important rider to that, which is not every ridiculous idea is useful. Now, when I sit and work with executive teams across industries across the world, very seldom do I come across teams who are comfortable spending time gathering and harvesting ridiculous ideas. It's almost as if we don't have time for that as their attitude. Ridiculous ideas are something we do if we had time, and we don't have time. And I think the inability to think far enough and wide enough has caught us in a state of ill preparedness for the context in which we find ourselves. If you're a business leader, just think about how much time in your regular Mancos and Exco meetings you devote to making sure that ridiculous ideas about your future as a business, your future as an industry, are continually put on the table. Have you developed that muscle? And not only must you be used to and comfortable with originating ridiculous ideas, we need to build the filters that filter out the non-useful ones. So the inability or the lack of imagination, for want of a better term, is one of the reasons we've been caught short. A second one might be that we continually, within our businesses, we operate at a sense of urgency. This Eisenhower decision matrix is very old, but it does a nice job of highlighting the intersection between things that are urgent and things that are important. We know that it is important to be ready for tomorrow's world. We know that it is important to develop the kind of adaptive DNA that we as an individual or we as an organization need. It's important, but seldom is it urgent. And very often in our businesses, we run at what is called the tyranny of the urgent. And so when things are urgent, they tend to occupy center stage and our energy and our focus. And I think that goes in part to explain why we have been caught short with this global pandemic. Not only were we not looking far enough and wide enough and exercising our imagination, but we were so preoccupied with the here and now, the quarterly returns, the urgent, that we didn't lift our head up long enough and high enough to see it. A third reason is a little bit more subtle, and we could spend a lot of time on this. It's what psychologists call inattentional blindness. In other words, we simply don't see certain things. On your screen is a repeat pattern of a shape that is known as a coffer in building terms, or a simple rectangular. As you look at that, can you see any circles? Now, some of you are looking at it and saying, Keith, you're crazy. There are no circles in that pattern. Others, the moment I mention circles, immediately maybe can see circles. Most people would battle to see the circles in that repetitive shape, but let me highlight a few for you on each row that might make seeing them a little bit easier. And of course, as these circles come up, you'll notice that on every single row of these coffers are repeated circles. And now that I've highlighted them, maybe you can see them easier. What is the point I'm trying to make here? The point is that who we are, our histories, our personalities, and our culture can get in the way of our ability to see what we often need to see. And this means we've got to do a whole lot of work in this area of learning how to see and not assuming that what we see is the whole picture. And this is often very real. So a couple of months ago, maybe a couple of years ago now, this picture went viral on social media. It was the picture of a dress that a mother-in-law intended wearing to her son's wedding. And she sent it to her daughter-in-law, basically kind of saying, is this going to fit in? Is it the right kind of coloring and patterning? And she mentioned the fact of, I'd like to wear this white and gold dress. And the incredulous answer came back to say, that's not white and gold. It's a completely different color. So as you look at that picture, what colors do you see? Now, I'm guessing that the majority of you are seeing a dress that is blue and black, because over 70% of people that look at this picture see the dress as blue and black. And there's about 30% of people who say it's not blue and black, it's gold and white. And you can have a heated argument as to what color this dress is. By the way, in the real story, the picture that was seen by the mother-in-law was a dress that was blue and black. And cognitive scientists and those who specialize in visual intelligence are still trying to work out what is happening in our brains when one person looking at the identical dress or picture sees gold and white and another person sees black and blue. What is going on here? We don't see accurately all the time. Monet was a famous painter who loved painting water lilies, and he, during his career, painted over 250 pictures of water lilies. And one of those paintings is on the screen, and you can see it now. And my instruction to you is have a look at that screen and notice everything that there is to see. Okay, I'll give you a few seconds just to fully embrace the screen that you're looking at and try and make a mental note of everything that you can see. Okay, let me move on and put up two other Monet paintings. And now I'm going to ask you, out of the three that you can see now, which was the first one that I showed you? Most people get it right, and most people immediately will say, it was number 3. And if you said number 3, you'd be quite right. But then if I had the ability to ask you, why did you pick number 3? Most people go to the detail of the painting, the shadow in the foreground, maybe the positioning of the bridge, or something unique that they see in painting 3 as opposed to 1 and 2. Notice the instruction was notice everything on your screen. And when I ask people to explain why they correctly chose painting 3, very, very few, in fact, less than 5% of people go to the drop shadow that accompanied that picture. The instruction wasn't just look at the picture, it was notice everything. And so again, very often our vision goes to the immediate material, the immediate content. And I think that is in part why we missed the global pandemic. Within our businesses, our minds and our vision was trained on our own business, our own sector, our own industry. We weren't paying attention to a broader range of circumstances that were hugely playing out and need to be played out. So if you're interested in some of this work, let me point you to the book of Amy Herman. She studies visual intelligence. She's an American woman, and she does work with people like the FBI, the CIA, law enforcement officers, detectives, etc., trying to build the capacity to help us to see what needs to be seen. She looks at how we need to assess things, how we need to analyze correctly, how we need to articulate things clearly, and then, of course, our response to all of that. How do we adapt as we learn to see better? I love her book cover because if you've noticed and you've been paying attention, you will see that the book cover in itself is fairly unique. Not only is her name upside down, that is fairly obvious, but the umbrellas at the top end of the picture give way to gumboots at the end. And so Amy's playing with us, even in introducing us to her book, with playing with a visual intelligence even as a cover. So that then leads us to the third question. And the third question we need to ask is exactly that is on your screen right there. We need to make sense of our current reality. And the way you make sense, not only do you see in order to understand the implications, the way to make sense of the implications in any context is to create frameworks of understanding. As a leader, the more access you have to frameworks, the better equipped you are to lead in a world that is full of ambiguity and a world that is full of paradox. So as Tomorrow Today, when the COVID-19 started to unfold, we worked hard to find a suitable framework by which we could understand the implications. Early on in the global pandemic, we had lots of exco teams contacting us and saying, what do you think the implications of where we find ourselves will be? And generally our answer was, we need to be patient. It is too soon to fully articulate the extent of the implications from this global pandemic. 3 months down the line, I think those implications are emerging. And what we essentially did, and this might be something you can employ and use and might be helpful for you and your leadership team, is we created 4 buckets, if you like, 4 categories in which we started to pay attention to what is happening globally. The first one was obviously personal. What does this mean for me as an individual? And of course, individually, it's played out very differently in very different ways across the world. There was a futurist by the name of Gibson who said the future's already happened. It's just unequally distributed. And certainly the impact of COVID-19 has been very uneven in its impact and distribution. So the one bucket or the one category would be personal. The second category would be we, the community, the society in which you live. What have been the implications there? One of the things, for instance, we noticed was that it seemed that societies generally started to take greater care of one another. Sometimes cultures lend more to that than other cultures around the world. Cultures like in many Eastern cultures that are far more communal in nature, that maybe just accentuated the communal nature of your society. But in many Western societies, they're very individualistic, very private, and there's not a great sense of community. And what they found out was that COVID-19 has unleashed this sense of community caring. Some people have reported, in fact, the exact opposite. So what have been some of the societal or communal implications of the context in which we find ourselves? Then, of course, the third category is work, and there have been huge implications for work. What's interesting for us is that research that supported the idea of giving greater flexibility to workers in terms of when they work and where they work, and it would enhance productivity and creativity. It would make them happier. It would give you a better worker. In the enforced thing through COVID-19, where we have been forced to work virtually, many businesses have found that research to now be true. And I guess there are many leaders who are saying, why didn't we do this before? So there have been massive work implications. And a lot of our work as Tomorrow Today has been helping organizations in that third category. What are the implications for where we find ourselves now when it comes to our particular business? And then obviously the last bucket or category to pay attention to would be global. What are some of the global implications of COVID-19? Again, just one example there for us is that I think when we look back on this period through the lens of history, we will see it as a time in which China emerged from the slipstream of the USA. I think there are going to be some significant geopolitical moves that will result as a result of this global pandemic. In my part of the world, where I'm based in London, no sooner had the British government voted on Brexit and started to implement that than the global pandemic hit. And so the global pandemic combined with Brexit will have massive geopolitical ramifications. Certainly, this global pandemic will affect and have global implications. So there would be a framework of 4 areas to pay attention to make sense of for you, your business, your community, what is going on. The fourth question as we follow this process through would then be to ask, well, what will we need to do? What will it take to thrive in a world that we know has changed? My answer is adaptability. I think that what this has shown us is that we at a personal level and at an organizational level need to be adaptive. Of course, again, this is messaging that we've always known. For a long time, people have been told that you need to be agile and nimble and adaptive. But now I think we have woken up to the reality that we really do need to be adaptive in how we think and how we go about our organization. So let me try and give you some practical hints as to what this might mean. How do you build adaptability in? 2 marine biologists by the name of Gundelson and Holling revealed that in the DNA of an adaptive process in a biological setting, 4 things need to happen. And when I first came across their research, I was amazed at how easily it translated into the business world. What these marine biologists were suggesting was that in order to enhance or to build adaptability, we need to do 4 things. We need to learn how to live with change and uncertainty. That is easier said than done. Some people are more adept at that than others, but at a personal level, at an organizational level, we need to understand that uncertainty and change is the prevailing norm. We then need to invite learning. You cannot be adaptive if you are not a learner. We need to embrace diversity, and we need to learn what it means to give away control. Now, I don't have time to unpack all 4 of these, so I've just picked 2 for our discussion and attention today. Let's look at the need to invite learning, because this is something all of us at an individual level can do. We need to be a learner. Alvin Toffler was a futurist who said the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So a couple of years ago, in the process of every year I tried to learn, unlearn, and relearn something, I decided I would teach myself to write with my left hand. I'm naturally right-handed, and I took a year to teach myself to write proficiently with my left hand. Pick up a pen right now. If you're sitting at a desk or you've got a piece of paper and a pen near you, pick up a pen and quickly sign your name. I think you've done that without even thinking, haven't you? You don't even need to miss a beat. You can sign your name. Now put that pen in your other hand and do the same thing. Now you'll find it's a little bit trickier and it needs a bit more practice and attention, but we need to learn. And so one of the key questions in the global pandemic, the context in which you find yourself or you as a business find yourself, is what are the lessons that we need to be learning now? The second one is around the need to unlearn. So the clip I'm going to show you is a gentleman who decided that an unlearning experiment would be a nice one if he got a bicycle and he reverse engineered it. In other words, every time he turned his handlebars to the right, the wheel went to the left. I'm also doing this experiment personally right now and having a lot of fun and a lot of accidents, I might add, as I'm doing it. But let me give him the opportunity to explain what he means.
It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck, but at least I could ride it.
So I think a key question to be asking at this time, especially for you as a business, is what is it we need to unlearn? We're not going to go back to the context as we once knew it. And it might be that you need to unlearn a whole lot of things about how to run your business and about what has made your business successful in the past, because when the context changes, so must we. Then this gentleman goes and he says, well, I've unlearned how to ride a bicycle and I've learned how to ride this different bicycle. And as I said, that's a lot easier said than done, as I'm finding out. He then said, well, can I go back and learn how to ride a regular bicycle? So he goes to Amsterdam, the city of bicycles, to see whether or not he can get back on a regular bicycle and ride it once again.
It's backwards. It's backwards. This was one of the most frustrating moments of my life. I had ridden a normal bike since I was 6, but in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I had set out to prove that I could free my brain from a cognitive bias. But at this point, I'm pretty sure that all I proved is that I could only redesignate that bias. So what you're not seeing is just a group of people here looking at me, looking at the strange American that can't ride a bike because they think I'm dumb. But I'm actually 2 levels deep into this because I've learned and unlearned. All right. After 20 minutes of making a fool out of myself, suddenly my brain clicked back into the old algorithm. I can't explain it, but it happened in a very specific moment. Got it.
So there are 3 really good questions. What is it we need to learn, unlearn, and relearn? The second out of the 4 areas that are highlighted as areas that build adaptive intelligence is this whole notion of giving control. And if you're a business leader, this is of real importance for you. And you've probably discovered with needing to work virtually now that maybe how you viewed authority and control in your business when you were all able to meet in the same place together was a very different scenario to the one that you face currently. What this disruption has shown, and disruption in general shows, that if we are to survive, if we are to adapt to the disruption, leadership and businesses need to learn what it means in their context to loosen control. And this is a difficult concept to get hold of, but let me try and illustrate it with just one nuance of what I'm talking about. Very often in most businesses, information flows to authority. So you have people who collect the data, collect the information, and it goes up to the senior decision makers in the business, and they make decisions. What I'm talking about, or one aspect that I'm talking about, is that an adaptive organization does it exactly the opposite way. It looks for how it can give authority to the people who have access to the information. So you have a great salesperson, and rather than have that salesperson give you the information so you can make the decision, why don't you cede authority to him or her so that faced with the information, they can respond far quicker? This actually comes out of a book written by Dave Marquette, who was the nuclear submarine commander in the US Navy. And his book is called Turn the Ship Around. I'd highly recommend reading this book, because here's the lesson. If this giving away control can be achieved on a nuclear submarine, I suspect it can be achieved in your business. But it's very counterintuitive. It goes against a lot of the management tools and mindsets that we have built up over decades. But my point is, if you want to be adaptive and you want an adaptive organization, you need to, amongst other things, learn what it means to give away control. So let me wrap up. What next for you then? Well, let me suggest 3 keys that you can consider. Number 1, we've already spoken about this. Number 1, pay attention to context. By understanding your particular context and framing it, you can start to make the right decisions. Don't fall into the trap of assuming that from everything from what was will simply be reinstituted. I think we're going to be living with COVID-19 for some time. In fact, we're telling our clients up to 2 years this condition will be in place. And so treat it as a marathon and not a sprint. When you train for a sprint, it's very different to training for a marathon. When I was younger, I ran a number of ultra marathons, and I remember when I first started out being quite intimidated by the distance of an ultra marathon, and I would go to seasoned runners and say, what is the best advice you can give me as I start running this ultra marathon? And to a person, the advice that always came back was, don't start too quickly. Go slow. If you're not used to the pace of a marathon and an ultra marathon, the biggest mistake that novices make is they start off too quickly. And I think we've experienced that with COVID-19. We've rushed to virtual learning as an example, and there's a real sense of screen fatigue right now. We need to treat this as a marathon, not a sprint. It's probably going to last for 2 years. The other thing under context is understand that for you, maybe it's still very much a crisis. I've met many businesses that are in real crisis mode, but it also might be an opportunity. So I don't say this glibly or lightly, because if you are in a crisis, finding and seeing the opportunity will take real work and discipline. But normally in a crisis, there's both the challenge of the crisis, but embedded in that, there's always an opportunity if you can find it. The second key I want to suggest is build adaptability into your DNA. Start with yourself. Stephen Covey many years ago talked about 2 circles, the circle of concern, which are things that we can't change, and the circle of influence, which are things we can change. And he said all too often we focus on the things we can't change. And when we do that too long, we become frustrated and angry and embittered. Rather than that, focus on what you can influence. And as you focus on what you can influence, so that circle of influence grows. It's never going to eliminate the circle of concern, but it is a very good move to focus on what you can change, what you can take responsibility for, rather than what you can't. The third key I want to suggest is this is an opportunity to reimagine. If you said to a caterpillar, I'd like you to reimagine yourself, the average caterpillar might say, that's great, thank you. I would like to be thinner so that I can move quicker, so that I'm not going to be eaten by other insects. Another caterpillar might say, okay, I would like to be green or brown, not brightly colored, because that would make it less obvious, my presence less obvious to predators. But of course, we all know the caterpillar story. A caterpillar that reimagines itself sees itself as a butterfly. And the point I'm making is this: as you think about how you're going to adapt and adjust to the current context in which we find ourselves, don't think of yourself in the form that took you into this crisis. You might need to see something completely different. The Economist in 2005 said this: real innovation is not product and service innovation. Real innovation is the ability to change your business model. And so maybe COVID-19 is an opportunity to consider changing your business model. Last thought, and this is around hope, because I've encountered so many people that are hopeless in this very serious situation in which we find ourselves. And you know, when you offer people hope, it's not just saying to them things will turn out well. You don't know they're going to turn out. None of us know how they're going to turn out. But I want to suggest that a more robust, a more accurate definition of what it means to be hopeful and often a hopeless situation is not to pay attention to the outcomes, but do what is right, regardless of the outcomes. Viktor Havel was the Czech president and prime minister, an artist and philosopher. And I think his definition of hope is a really good one to hold on to as at a time such as this. My time is up, so thank you from my side. I know we'll go back to Rakesh, and maybe there are a couple of questions we can engage with, but I'd just like to thank you for being with me. And if you would like this slide deck, then please do go to the Bitly link, or rather the talk link, and there you download the entire PDF of these slides. I'd like to get them to you if they can be useful in your context. So thank you very much. Rakesh.
Thank you so much, Keith, for a wonderful session. I realize that 35 minutes is not enough for us to talk on this subject. There's so much to learn on the subject that you spoke of. There's so many questions, at least in my mind, which are going around. I only hope we had more time, but thank you very much for this very insightful session. Big messages that I take away from the session today, Keith, is from your talk is surest way to fail tomorrow is to keep doing what you're doing today. So accept change, embrace uncertainty, learn something new every day, because when the context changes, so must we. I think that sort of summarizes a lot of what you said for me, Keith. And it was just lovely listening to you, as I was expecting. So I'll dive into the questions now, Keith. And the first question is, I think, is a very fundamental and the most basic question. Since you're a global leadership expert and you've worked with some of the top leaders across continents, across plethora of industries. So my first question is that everyone has their own take on leaders, traits of a leader, and what leadership is. What, according to you, is a definition of a leader and leadership?
That's a great question. And you're right. I think that how we view leadership plays out very differently dependent on the culture in which we are. So cultures that are far more authoritarian and hierarchical in nature would have a very different view to the role of a leader as opposed to a context where maybe there's less emphasis on authority, on bureaucracy, on hierarchy. But I'm going to borrow the adaptive leadership definition of a leader. And a leader is somebody who helps others or helps people make progress through their most difficult challenges. And I like that because a lot of the challenges we're facing today are adaptive in nature. And what that essentially means, it's about knowing what to do when we don't know what to do. And I'm finding more and more senior leaders are finding themselves at that juncture. Their experience is no longer helpful because tomorrow's solutions are not going to be found in yesterday's solutions. And so this is why leaders need to be learners. And if you're asking questions and you're curious and you're a learner, finding the next solution is much easier than just trawling through your experience. So when you understand the adaptive nature of leadership, it's about helping people make progress through their most difficult challenges. And however that then plays out, how you do that, I think will then depend on circumstance and situation. But I like that definition of a leader.
Thanks, Keith. Shout out to our audience. Keep your questions coming. I'm now diving into the questions from audience, Keith. The first one is from Raman, and he wants to know, I think you spoke of culture just now. In your opinion, how can companies establish a culture of idea generation or innovation? Raman says that it may not be enough for us to just put out a statement of intent or set up idea meetings, but there may be some fundamental changes one would have to make in the organization. So what is a good way to go about it?
It's a great question. Thank you, Ron, for asking it. I think building a culture takes time. So all too often, innovation has been a very popular byword in business for some time. So, a CEO or someone reads a book and says, right, we're going to be innovative. I want you to be innovative. But there's a lot that might need to be unpicked in a business in order to generate ideas and be truly innovative. So one of the things I'd look at is your incentives or your remuneration systems, because take sales, for example. We often incentivize sales teams on a competitive basis. We reward those who bring in the most sales, and we don't encourage our sales team to share leads, because you might be better positioned than me to land this prospective client. But if I'm going to be measured on my bottom line, what I contribute to sales, I might then be very reluctant to pass on a good lead to somebody who's better positioned, because it might reflect on their scorecard rather than mine. And the result is we lose the business. So very often we incentivize people on a very strongly competitive basis, but we preach the language of collaboration, and those two clash. Another one would be, to what extent do your people ask questions and have the liberty to ask questions? So I was working with a CEO the other day who said, I don't think my team ask enough questions. So I said, all right, at your next Manco meeting, why don't you keep a little pad next to you? And every time during your entire day's meeting, somebody on your team asks a question, just put a tick and let's test your assumption. And he was horrified. He came out of a full day meeting saying, in the entire day of deliberation, we asked, I think, 3 or 4 questions. That can't be good. And so again, we then devised a way to start building in a culture of generating questions. So how are your senior people learning? How are they asking questions? To what extent are they curious? There are a lot of tools and techniques that can be quite fun playing with. Demanding that somebody learns something new. As I talked about, something is unlearned every month, or something is relearned. And as you start building this muscle, it becomes easier. You don't go to gym if you want to get fit and go once or go on one run. You've got to do it regularly. And in fact, it often seems like you're getting worse rather than better, until one day it just clicks and you realize that you are in a good place. Getting innovative and building a culture of innovation is a little bit like getting fit. It's going to take hard work. It's going to require habitual practice, and it's probably going to seem a little bit worse and weird before it gets better. So let me quickly recommend 2 books. There's a wonderful book by Catherine Schultz called Being Wrong. Schultz is a social psychologist, and she talks about how we approach the subject of being wrong. And we often excuse it away. We don't admit to our wrongness, if you like. We say, I was wrong, but. And it's a nice take, because she says when you start to get a healthy perspective on the importance of being wrong, that means you start to open up the channels of being a learner and the ability to change. And when you have a comfort level around change and you want to be a learner, that means you can start to impact on your worldview and build self-awareness. So she starts from an unusual place in terms of the innovative process, from let's look at why and how we deal with being wrong. Another book that might be of interest is The Geography of Thought by Richard Nesbitt. He is, again, a psychologist. And what he does is he looks at how people in different parts of the world think differently. And if I understand, if I'm working in China or Japan or Brazil, that maybe I'm working with a group of people who don't think the same as I do, don't see the same as I do, and I can work hard to build some kind of middle ground, because it's not about being right or wrong, but I can build a middle ground and be aware of these differences in perception. I start to create an opportunity for us to learn together. So rather than go the traditional route of looking at books on innovation and how you can build innovation into your business, I'm suggesting a different route. Books like The Geography of Thought, books like Being Wrong, and of course there are a whole lot of others. The book Adaptive Intelligence, or Adaptive Leadership rather, by Ron Halflich. Halflich is a Harvard professor. Highly recommend that reading as well. If you want to build a process of innovation and giving away control, I've already mentioned Dave Marquette's book, Turn the Ship Around. The other one would be General Stanley McChrystal, who wrote a book called Team of Teams. Be a reader, be a learner. Make sure your executive team are reading these kind of books. Find common questions and then engage. And tomorrow, today, we have a book club. And we, as we all read, we every now and then come across a must-read book. And I'll say to my colleagues, we've all got to get our heads and hearts around this book. And then we have a process whereby we can make sure that collectively we extract the maximum applications from that particular book for our business. So maybe start a book club in your organization that will extract applications from good books to read and apply.
Right. Thank you, Keith. I think there's a follow-on question from what you just said. I think partly you've answered it. The question that Shweta has is, you say the key defining factors for a successful leader include the ability to learn, grow, and be adaptable. And you spoke of adaptive intelligence. So other than what you just mentioned, Keith, what are the other ways leaders can build adaptive intelligence?
So I would look no further than those 4 areas. We call that the DNA of adaptive intelligence, because DNA has 4 elements. And why I like those 4 elements is it comes out of research. So when we use the term adaptive, adaptability comes from a biological framing. The originality of being adaptive is something that is applied to evolutionary biology. Systems adapt. So if you're going to really try and dig and find out what it means for us as a business to be adaptive, you probably in your research will end up going into the areas of biological adaptive processes. And why I like those 4 things is it comes out of solid research. It was looking at evolutionary biology. Okay, so it's not just some consultant's opinions because it's a nice alliteration or 4 nice things. It's based on research, number 1. And if you then dig into each one of those 4 areas, they offer very practical insights. So I didn't even talk about the ability to live with change and uncertainty. Now, if you're an accountant, what makes you a good accountant is that you probably have a brain that sees in terms of black and white. It's very difficult for you to see gray. It's very difficult for you to be comfortable with ambiguity. The way your brain works as an accountant is that you like to default to black and white, to certainty. So when you start talking about living with change and uncertainty, it starts at a very personal level. Some people are more adept at doing it than others. So it becomes a personal agenda. Now, what does that translate into your organization? At an organizational level, here's the thought. I think we can throw away most of our tools that we've currently used up to this point in time in shaping adaptive plans, strategic plans. The tools that we've used for strategic planning and our reliance on strategic planning makes no sense in a world that is uncertain. So rather than detail a strategic plan, as a business leader, I would rather have my people think strategically at every level of the organization. Now, what does that look like? And how do I build that capacity rather than the formation of a plan that I then rely on? In the 2008 global economic crisis, in an instant, we could throw away all our strategic forecasts and plans because of that 2008 crisis. And that should have been the wake-up call. That should have been the first shot that we paid attention to say, you know what, that how we've gone about building strategic plans is redundant. So learning to live with change and uncertainty. I've highlighted a personal and a business application. We then talked about the need to learn. You cannot be adaptive if you are not a learner. So when I sit with an executive team, here's what happens often in our businesses. Learning is good for everybody else but the senior leaders, but the executive team. And when I come across a business where that plays out, I know I'm probably not dealing with an adaptive business. When I'm in a London business school with senior leaders and I hear this question, a hand goes up and they'll say, Keith, have our exco heard what you're telling us? And when I hear a question like that, I can be fairly certain that there's a gap between the exco thinking and behavior and what I'm telling senior leaders. So now if I were to sit with that exco team, I'd be quite hard on them because I'm dealing with a client right now who wanted to initiate an entire adaptive leadership series in their organization. And I said to them, I'd love to do that work, but I'll only do it if I can first engage with you. So rather than 3 steps to the process, there needs to be a step 0. And step 0 is time with you as an executive, because you need to know what I'm going to be telling your people. And if you're not supportive of that, aware of that, this can be a very dangerous message. So being a learner, again, is complex, be it individually or organizationally. I haven't even touched on diversity. That's a whole subject, the need to embrace diversity. And then we look very, very lightly at giving away control. You could make an entire leadership development process, or an entire day just looking at what those 4 elements mean. So your question, sorry, I went on a tangent. Your question was, what can we do to be more adaptive? There's probably a lot of things, but you will find ample to do just within each of those 4 areas, both individually and collectively.
Thanks, Keith. I've got a challenge question here, and this question incidentally came last week to Tom as well, from a different person, I'm assuming. So Srinivas Yalamuthi wants to know that you mentioned that leaders have to create a certain kind of culture and they have to sort of embrace this whole uncertainty and all that stuff. But this question is in the current context of COVIDian times, that your frontal cortex is in full gear because you have to deal with an emergency situation. The business is at threat, so you've got to think short-term survival before you can start thinking of long-term plans and so on and so forth. So what would be your recommendations to the leaders to how should they go about this particular situation when you know that the short-term to medium term is so uncertain and pretty much could threaten their business?
Great question. And I'm sure Tom would have spoken a bit about, he made a stellar contribution to this whole idea of Reimagine. But my answer to that is that get used to the crisis. Yes, it's exacerbated right now and it's at its peak right now. But I think that good businesses understand that the next crisis is one short step away. And so going back to relative calm is probably unrealistic, that we need to embrace what it means to fly through turbulence or sail through rough waters, that the notion of clean sea or clean air is probably unrealistic. So what can you do? Well, it probably doesn't differ to the areas that you need to pay attention to long term anyway. So the question started out by asking around culture. If I was asked to go into an organization and let's say do a cultural audit, there would be 4 areas of the business that I'd look at to give me an insight as to the culture of that particular business. So I would look at the information, how information gets disseminated within the business, who has it, who doesn't have it. The information flow in a business would tell me an awful lot about the culture of the business. The second area I'd look at is decision rights. Who makes the decisions? Who has the rights to make those decisions and who doesn't? So the decision rights would give me a clue. I would then look at the incentives or the motivators in the business. How do you motivate or incentivize the behavior that you want in your business? And then the last area I'd look at would be your structure. And so your culture is dependent on how those 4 areas play out. And right now in the crisis that you're facing, those 4 areas might have come under different strain, but they're still very present. And you might need to do things in the short term in those 4 areas that are different to what you're going to do long term. But by having that framework around culture, what you do now can then still play out long term. So now might be a great time to make sure that authority flows to information. I'm talking more and more to companies right now about you've realized that you need to make your structure your strategy. Strategy is not a plan around increasing your bottom line or hitting those targets because it's too unpredictable, it's too volatile. You need to make your structure your strategy. And what I mean by that is if you've got a structure in your business that is resilient, and resilient means the ability to change shape rather than a structure that is robust, that is rigid, then regardless of the external circumstances you face, your company can change shape. So many companies are starting to realize this, that we had a structure that wasn't suited to a world that has now gone virtual. So what a great time to make sure that you start putting in the building blocks for a structure to be your strategy, for a structure to be adaptive, a structure to be resilient rather than robust. So I would look at those 4 areas. I would ask what needs to be done now, but don't think that once we emerge from COVID-19 that those 4 areas go away. And things that you put in place now you might want to keep. So in my business of leadership education and leadership development, most of my work was spent with executives and business schools or directly in their boardrooms. A lot of that's going to stay online. I don't anticipate going back to the world that it was. On average, every year I would do, let's say, 140 flights. This year, I think to date, I've done less than 25. I'm not anticipating getting on a plane again this year. But one day there will be the resumption of travel. But lessons learned currently will still remain in place. So I'm saying to a lot of businesses, there are aspects of leadership development that can't be done online, and you shouldn't attempt it online. There are other aspects that can be done online. And I think when I get back into a London Business School classroom, and I do stuff that I might have done prior to COVID-19, I'm going to be challenged. People will say, why have you brought us to London to do something that I could have been at home in Madrid or in Rio de Janeiro and done just as well at home? So it's going to change how educators educate, how teachers teach. And I think for you as a business, it's going to be the same. Why would you go back into the same shape? You might need to keep certain things online, certain levels of functionality and flexibility, and other things will change as you do go back into a greater sense of normality.
Keith, that's very provoking. Now, let me just ask you one question on what you just mentioned. So since you're a futurist, what do you see disappearing from the world? A product, a service, or a way of doing things as a result of this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think what this pandemic has accentuated is trends that were in place prior to it. So let me pick maybe an obvious one, and that is if in retail, high street, what's called the high street in the UK, but basically walk-in retail has been warned for years that all the tendency is going to online buying, online shopping. And that if I am going to walk into a shop, it's not necessarily to buy the product, it's to have an experience. It's a different kind of orientation. And what this global pandemic has done overnight is shut down high-end retail buying. Consequently, what has gone through the roof is online buying. So we've been tracking which businesses have benefited by online buying, online access to information. An interesting business that I wouldn't have anticipated that has grown exponentially. In fact, the biggest growth online has been in telemedicine. So if the biggest growth has been in telemedicine, I've got a number of big pharmaceutical clients, don't expect that to come back to pre-COVID levels. It might drop a bit, but it's still going to stay out there. And if it does stay out there, it's going to impact on the medical practitioners. Your medical practice won't be the same as it was. So I think retail is an obvious one. Medical or telemedicine is another obvious one. And I think what this pandemic has done, it's accelerated trends that were already in place. And we just need to pay attention to those.
What do you think future of small business is going to be as a result of what we are seeing? So there was anyways a lot of disruption thanks to technology, AI, ML, power of computing and all that sort of stuff, capital getting concentrated with few businesses, big getting bigger. Now that's only going to accelerate, and we're seeing that augmenting. Like you also mentioned, not every business is capable of setting up online. So how do you see that playing out for small and medium scale enterprises going forward?
Two things quickly. I would say to a small business owner who might be listening, a framework we often use to pay attention to what's going to change and why, we call the tides of change. And tides is an acronym that says there are 5 key disruptors. And if you're paying attention to each one of these 5 disruptors and asking the right questions in each one of these 5 areas, you will go a long way to future-proofing yourself. The 5 areas, very quickly, are technology. So how's technology going to impact my business? The I in tides is institutional change. The D is demographics. The E is environment. And the S is societal values. And what we are seeing is that those 5 key disruptors are still playing out right now. But I think that small businesses have a great advantage over bigger businesses. I'm finding that, and I work with some very large multinationals, is that they are slower to respond to external change. They have deeper pockets, they have bigger muscles, and they have deeper resources, no doubt. But their ability to respond to a fast-changing external environment is severely hampered. And the advantages that small businesses have is that they can be far more adaptive, far more responsive. For the first time in business history, small businesses can compete on an equal footing with big businesses thanks to technology. You can sit in a room in your home in your slippers or with bare feet, and have a global network and be doing global business, and no one would be the wiser. And I think the pandemic will accelerate that trend towards small, flexible, adaptive businesses and mindsets. Last week, I was within a room full of 15 CEOs of small to medium businesses, and it was amazing because embedded in their DNA was a far greater tendency to be adaptive. They're less bureaucratic. They're more flexible. They share information freer, etc., etc. So don't think, if you're a small business owner, that you are disadvantaged in your sector and in your industry. There obviously will be big players. Look at what the constraints are and ask yourself, how can I leverage and position myself in a way that big business in my sector or industry is unable to, because they're just slow. Big businesses have what we call silos for the most part, and very often those silos don't communicate or speak smoothly to each other. Just think about the banking industry. Banks are full of silos: personal, mortgage, car, etc. And where the world is expecting and clients are expecting collaboration and coordination and a smoothness of product and product delivery, banks very often can't deliver that. Smaller financial entrepreneurs can. And so banks are hugely threatened by fintech. And the fintech operators are not wanting to be a bank. They are simply taking the part of banking, the banking part that is more profitable, and that's leaving bigger, larger banks very, very vulnerable. So I don't know how to answer if you don't have access to technology, because I think you do need access to technology, and today it can be on a smartphone. It doesn't have to be elaborate IT systems. In fact, big companies that've got elaborate IT departments, again, are at a disadvantage, because often what happens is the IT department strangles the ability of the company to respond appropriately. So I think you should be encouraged, if you're a small business owner, and say, what technology do I need that will give me what I need? How do I build institutionally? What are the demographic shifts that are happening? Environment, societal values, etc. But you have a huge advantage in many cases over the larger players in your industry.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Very encouraging, and I'm sure our audience who are engaged in small and medium scale enterprises would have found that very, very useful. Keith, my colleague and producer of the show is telling me it's time up, so I wanted to check with you. Do we have time for 2 more questions, or I restricted to 1 question? So, Keith, can I ask you two more questions, or I should just keep it to one?
No, you listen to the person who's putting the plug on this, but ask away.
No, then we go for two questions here. So, Keith, this question is from Rama, and a lot is being said about work from home, work remote as a result of this pandemic, and that's something which a lot of organizations are seeing as a real benefit on real estate, and also in the way workforces are organized. How do you see that, and what could be the outcome of this strategy that a lot of large organizations at least are looking at adopting in terms of culture, in terms of innovation, this whole team cohesiveness? So what's your take on that?
I don't think a lot of companies, the workforce in a lot of companies are going to want to go back to the office. I think, as I said earlier, what we have found out is that people are more productive and happier at home. And I think it's going to have a massive demographic implication, for instance, to the inner city, where suddenly you've got building space that's unoccupied, parking space that's unoccupied. So there are all kinds of side shows there. But I think that a lot of businesses have found that people have enjoyed working from home. And don't want to go back to the office and office hours as we've known, and that won't impact at all on the business output. So a lot of the work we've been doing is to helping businesses know how to lead and manage virtual teams, because what you can't do is simply take the office structure home with you. If you've got small kids, or both you and your partner or spouse were professionals and now you find yourself at home and you both need to work. So it's not as simple as saying take the office home. You have to have a completely different mindset around what it means to work at home. Another practical clue would be stop measuring inputs and measure outputs. I was dealing with a client the other day who said, we want to know that our people who are working at home are at their computer at 8 o'clock in the morning and stay. And I said, that's crazy. Measure outputs. Does it really matter in what they do, whether they're at their computer at 2 o'clock in the morning or 11 o'clock in the morning? Measure outputs. What are they responsible for producing? So I think that what we've got to appreciate in this virtual kind of flexible space we now find ourselves in, whether we like it or not, is that what it means to carry on with it and what it will mean to work from home is going to require new skill sets. I was saying to a leader the other day who was kind of unaware of this, and saying when you're on a screen with all your executive team, any small distraction that you engage in can send a huge ripple message to your team. So an example is I look away and I look outside and I'm distracted. I've got a team member who's speaking while I do that, and it throws them completely. Or I wear glasses, and so I take off my glasses and I do this while a team member's speaking. I might be sending a message that I don't want to send. And so even at a leadership level, how you lead and manage virtual teams is going to require new awarenesses and new skill sets. How we engage and interact, screen fatigue, etc. Now, this is all for me wonderful opportunities to learn and to do this. But in answer to the question, don't expect things to go back to the way they were. For one thing, staff won't want that to be. They've enjoyed the freedom and flexibility that they've now got, that research has showed will always be to the company's benefit. And so what our company looks like as we emerge from COVID-19 is probably going to be very different in terms of its processes and its structures and its rhythms and its routines.
Superb. Thank you so much, Keith. The last question, maybe. I don't want the conversation to end, so but I guess all good things come to end. So Keith, one last question. What could be your message to all our audience who are in the middle of their career, somewhere between 5 to 10 years into the job, and now they're looking at things getting changed, and like I said, things have always been changing. Now the acceleration is going to be that much faster. What would be your advice to them? How should they go about their careers going forward?
Yeah. So much would depend on the individual I was talking to and what career they were in. But let me generalize very broadly. I would encourage a person mid-career to really know what their purpose is without giving them concrete advice as to how to get there, because I think it would be tragic to get to the end of your working life and find that you had misinvested your time and your resource I think that you should work very hard at clarifying the meaning that you bring to work. Very often, if you look to get meaning from work and that work is taken away from you, it can be devastating. So rather than try and extract meaning from work, try and bring meaning to work. That means I take responsibility for meaning, for a sense of purpose. I regard myself at a personal level as one of the luckiest people on the planet. I worked for the first 15 to 20 years of my working career in the non-profit sector in South Africa. In fact, among street kids, it was a real sense of purpose. And then for the last 20, 25 years have been doing this work around helping organizations and individuals get future fit. And neither of those careers has felt like a career, because both were underpinned by a real sense of purpose. I love getting up and doing what I do. It doesn't matter whether it's the weekend or midweek. Those kind of time slots blur for me. And I would encourage a mid-career person is, why are you doing what you're doing? Is this what you want to do? Was it something that your parents pushed you into do? Was it forced by circumstances? And if you can uncover a real sense of personal purpose, then that becomes the foundation and the building block to then what you do. Now, you might not always be able to work in a specific work environment that fulfills your purpose, but if you know what your purpose is, it can influence how you make the decisions that ultimately get you closer to your sense of purpose. So coming back to the global pandemic, suddenly people being forced to work from home, for many men, has reconnected them with their families. And for some, that's been a bad thing. For many, it's been an eye-opener. And they realize how much they've missed by playing the role that a typical male in many societies plays by being outside of the home environment. So pay attention to your sense of purpose. Know who you are and understand what it is you want to get to. Covey talks about start with the end in mind. And work backwards. Find that sense of purpose. We talk in the work I do on leadership is you lead out of who you are. So who is the self that leads? You cannot divorce leadership practice from self-awareness. And when you understand who it is that leads, you can then be a very effective leader. Leading is not a set of skills that you add externally. It is that and more. And the more is doing the internal landscaping, the internal work. You lead out of who you are, the character ethic of leadership. So that's where the conversation would go. And that's the kind of conversation I'd love to have with people over a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, because when you start to orientate around that conversation, it starts to get real and very serious.
Absolutely fabulous, Keith. And I hope that cup of coffee happens sooner than later for us. I would love to share a coffee and continue this conversation. Keith, there's so much that I learned, and I'm sure the audience really enjoyed listening to you. There's so many good thoughts. The perspectives that you shared are absolutely remarkable, and I'm sure people who are listening to us today would have really gained a lot. But before I thank you formally and sign off the show, one last question. I'm pulling my boss card out so that Ashish doesn't blame me later. But it's not really a question. It's a very quick one for you. You are South African based in London, and you, as you told me, you love India. Which one? And you love cricket. Which one is your favorite cricket team? India, England?
Oh no, my attitude is anyone but England. I think there's a tremendous bond that exists between South African cricket and Indian cricket. So you'll remember, and I went to the one test match in Durban, where it was my home in South Africa. India were the first team to tour South Africa post-isolation, and of course India was the first South African team with Clive Rice, you remember, went to India post-isolation once apartheid collapsed. And so I think that forged a very special relationship between India and South Africa at a cricket level. And as a South African, your two arch enemies are always Australia and England. And so anyone but England. I've got to say very carefully while I live in England, and right now, of course, England are playing the West Indies as we speak. But no, India would always get my votes in an India versus England clash.
Yeah, if South Africa and India not playing, you can cheer for England.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Keith, for everything today. It was, like I said, it's a pleasure to have you. It was a privilege to have you with us on the show, for so openly sharing your thoughts with us. We're very, very grateful to you, sir. Thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much. You know what I should have said in answer to your great question just now was a personal friend of mine is Andrew Hudson, and he was on that first tour to India. It was his baby. And when he talks about India and the joy that comes from the ticket, he said, anyway, so we won't go there, but Andrew and I know each other quite well. But thank you again for the opportunity to address your audience and for the privilege that has been. And I wish you everything that is going forward. Well done on this initiative. It's been tremendous.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Take care.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's session. Guys, I hope you enjoyed it. It's time for me to announce the two lucky winners. So I'm quickly going to go through the list of questions. The first winner is Raman, asked the question around culture. How do you really build a culture that breeds idea as a process? And the other second winner is Srinivas Yalamati, who asked the question regarding how do you deal with this current situation as a leader when you are so engaged in here and now in the short term. Thank you very much, Srinivas, and thank you very much, Raman, for asking these two questions. Please ping us your email IDs so that we can ship the vouchers to you. Mention your email IDs in the comment section. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. A big thanks, as always, to our community support partners, AdGully, Paul Writer, Netcore, everybody who's been supporting us on this show, and a big thank you to Brand Equity for being the knowledge partner for us on this show. So thank you very much, folks. I look forward to seeing you next Friday. I guess it's the same time. So let's get back next Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you very much.